Probably the most familiar story in the New Testament Gospels is the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. I'm pretty sure this is the best known story of the Gospels because it's in all the Hollywood movies. I mean, if you do a movie about Jesus, you've got to have Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. It's so much a requirement that even Mel Gibson, who the Passion of the Christ, which is about Jesus' last hours, has to get this in, and so he has a flashback showing this scene of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. So the way the story works, it's found only in the Gospel of John, chapter 7 and 8. And Jesus is teaching the temple, and the Jewish leaders they drag this woman in front of him, and they say, she's been caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says we're to stone someone like this. What do you say? See, this is setting a trap for Jesus, because if Jesus says, well, yeah, stone her, then he's violating his teachings of love and mercy. But if he says, no, forgive her, then he's breaking the law of Moses. So what's it going to be? Well, Jesus has his way of kind of getting out of these traps, as you know, if you read the New Testament. So what he does in this case is he stoops down and he starts writing on the ground. And he looks up and he says, let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. Stoops back down, starts writing again. And one by one, feeling guilt of their own sins, they begin to leave until Jesus looks up again and there's no one left. And he says to the woman, is there no one left to condemn you? And she says, no, Lord, no one. Jesus replies, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. This story, this beautiful story, this powerful story, which has two terrific lines from Jesus in it, this story was not originally in the Gospel of John. This is a story that was added to the Gospel of John by later scribes. How do I know that? We have a number of early manuscripts of the Gospel of John. This story is not found in any of our early or best manuscripts of the Gospel of John. The Greek authors who wrote commentaries on the Gospel of John over the centuries don't mention this story until the 10th century, 1,000 years after the days of Jesus. The writing style of this story, if you read it in Greek, the writing style is a completely different writing style from the writing style of the rest of the Gospel of John. As a result, scholars have known for years that this story did not originally belong in the Gospel of John. Well, why is it in our English Bibles then? Probably what happened was some scribe had heard this story. They'd heard the story and they decided that it illustrated some of the teachings in John chapter 7, and so they wrote out the story in a margin. A second scribe came along, saw the story in the margin, and thought it belonged in the text, and then wrote his manuscript by putting the story in the text. Another scribe comes along and copies that manuscript, and that manuscript gets copied, and so on until it becomes part of the textual tradition. And it's these later manuscripts that were used by the translators of the King James Bible in 1611, so that the story came into English through the King James Bible. So this story, however, is not a story that was originally in the New Testament. So people sometimes ask me, well, are there any changes that are significant in the New Testament? Yeah, well, this strikes me as a rather significant change, that the story of the woman taken in adultery wasn't originally there. Or consider a second instance of another big difference, the Gospel of Mark. Mark is probably my favorite gospel because it's so subtle and understated in places, and it says things that you don't expect. And nowhere is this more true than in the ending of Mark's gospel. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is put on trial, and he's crucified, he's dead, he's buried, and on the third day, the women go to the tomb. The tomb is empty, and Jesus is not in it. There's some man in there. And the man tells the women that Jesus is not here, he's been raised from the dead. He tells the women, go tell the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. And then it says the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. That's where it ends. That's the end of the Gospel of Mark. And you think, how could it end there? They're told to tell the disciples, but they don't tell anybody. Didn't the disciples ever learn? Didn't they go to Galilee? Didn't they see Jesus? How could that be the end of the story? And that's exactly the reaction the scribes had. They got to that ending, they said, how could it end there? And scribes then decided it couldn't add there, and so they added 12 verses. So that in your English Bibles today, you'll find 12 more verses after that, after chapter 16, verse 8. And often they'll be in double brackets because the translators will tell you in a footnote, these verses weren't originally in here. These were added by later scribes. In these verses, in these added verses, the scribes added later, but we know they're added later because they're not in the earliest and best manuscripts. The writing style is different from the rest of the Gospel of Mark, and in fact there are inconsistencies between this ending and the verses that precede it. So this is clearly an addition to the Gospel of Mark. In these final verses, according to these final verses, the women do go tell the disciples do go to Galilee, they do meet Jesus there, and Jesus then tells them that they're to make disciples of all the nations, and people who become his disciples will be able to speak in foreign languages that they previously didn't know. They'll be able to handle deadly snakes, and they'll be able to drink poison and it won't harm them. These are the verses that the Appalachian snake handlers in my part of the world use to base their liturgical practices on. I've always thought that sometime in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, somebody should point out, well, actually those verses aren't in the Gospel of Mark. Mark actually ends with the women not saying anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Somebody added the last 12. Let me give. Are there textual changes that affect Christian doctrine? Well, it kind of depends how you look at things. There certainly are passages that affect Christian doctrine. There are passages in which scribes changed passages to emphasize that Jesus was divine. They changed other passages to emphasize that he was human. And so they wanted to emphasize that he was both human and divine. And so they changed passages so that it would look that way. One passage in particular is kind of interesting that is directly related to Christian doctrine, is that the doctrine of the Trinity is not explicitly taught in any passage of the Bible. In other words, the doctrine that there are three gods... Sorry. Dan Brown speaking once more. The doctrine that there's one God manifest in three persons, that these three persons are each individually completely God, but there's only one God. Not three gods, but one God, but not one person, three persons. So the three in one. This is not taught in any passage of the Bible except 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, in which the author says that there are three witnesses in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. That's a pretty explicit statement about the Trinity. Now, there's an interesting story about this passage because it doesn't show up in the Greek manuscripts of 1 John. It's in the Latin manuscripts of 1 John. When the first scholar to put together a printed Greek New Testament produced his work, this was Erasmus, who was a humanist from Rotterdam, in the year 1516. He put together for the first time the printed edition of the Greek New Testament. He didn't include the verse, because it wasn't in the manuscripts that he had. And the Latin theologians went ballistic. And according to the story that circulated, Erasmus said, look, it's not in any of the Greek manuscripts. And they said, yes, but it's part of the church's doctrine. You've gotten rid of the Trinity. And Erasmus said, look, if you can produce a Greek manuscript that has it in it, I'll include it in my next edition. And so they produced a Greek manuscript. And so they copied out a Greek, somebody copied out a Greek, and when they got to that point, they translated the Latin back into Greek, stuck it in, and Erasmus was true to his word, and included that in his next edition. And it was on the basis of that edition that the King James Bible translators put the Bible into English. So that's why the verse showed up in the King James translation. So yeah, that certainly affects doctrine. Now,
فويل للذين يكتبون الكتاب بأيديهم ثم يقولون هذا من عند الله ليشتروا به ثمنا قليلا فويل لهم مما كتبت أيديهم وويل لهم مما يكسبون